As a method of interrogating the second edition of Morris's Ladies' Garment Cutting and Making for its relevance to wartime fashion, I used it to create a dress that obeyed the austerity regulations introduced by the British Board of Trade from 1942. They set both maximum and minimum standards across a range of production processes, such as numbers of pleats, pockets and seams, size measurements, seam allowances and stitch lengths. They also forbade decorative techniques such as embroidery, ruching and braid. To begin, I chose a style from Morris's book to draft and make, requiring me to scan the various dresses to determine if they were appropriate. Figure 141, for example, had too many pleats and too many illustrated buttons, though the pattern does not actually dictate the number of buttons in its instructions. Figure 118 appealed to me because it seemed to be a good example of the fashion for fitted waists and skirts with fullness focused at the front, which were described in Vogue in early 1945. This would make it a good example of how fashions from later in the war were not far removed from earlier styles. However, the gathered centre front neck detail breaks austerity rules, in that the gauging or ruching does not contribute to fit, or in other words, is not functional but purely decorative. Like figure 141, it is illustrated with many small buttons, though its thin fabric tie belt meets the requirements in its width and lack of metal components. In the end, I chose figure 192. This is a shirt-style dress, one of the core styles that took prominence during wartime fashion, and features interesting angled seam lines that would lend themselves well to being cut in contrasting fabrics, one of the ways in which designers added interest to their button-up dresses. I was also interested to see that although the illustration for figure 192 changed between the first and second editions of the book, the drafting instructions and diagram did not, at all. This is a good example of how the basis of many garments remained the same as before the war, with small changes such as collars and hemlines altered to keep up to date. A key consideration when drafting the pattern was adherence to the standard size charts. While the book allows for the substitution of custom measurements, it also gives a table of standard measurements. When this table is compared to the one imposed by the Board of Trade, they don't seem to align, with the waist measurements given by Morris being much smaller than those on the standard chart. However, Morris's chart refers to the body measurements, whereas the austerity chart refers to finished garment measurements. In this way, buyers could be certain of minimum measurements for each size, rather than relying on each manufacturer's system of wearing ease. Morris states that he allows 1 inch wearing ease over the bust, 3 at the waist, and none over the hip measurement. When this ease is applied to his body measurement chart, the resulting garment sizes are fairly similar to the standard austerity chart, especially in the middle range of sizes. This could suggest that manufacturers were already working to similar sizes, and the austerity regulations simply refined and codified them for consistency. For my fabric, I chose a rayon crepe, as rayon was increasingly popular during the war. Rayon crepe was also used by some of the haute couture designers in their austerity utility collections commissioned by the Board of Trade. I used 2 coordinating colours to add interest, seeing as embroidery, lace, braid and ruching were banned. At the cutting stage, I had to decide my seam allowances. Morris states that 3/8 of an inch were usually allowed in the wholesale trade, but austerity required 3/4 of an inch for rayon garments. Larger seam allowances can mean more fabric is used, which seems counterintuitive for regulations designed to minimise the resources used per garment. However, larger seam allowances allow for alterations to be made, and can even provide fabric for patching or mending clothes, so contribute to the longevity of a garment. In fact, the amount of fabric per garment was never formally controlled by austerity, except in women's underwear. This does not mean, however, that the amount of fabric used was irrelevant. Yardage was linked to coupon pointing, providing motivation to reduce the amount of fabric and thus the number of coupons a garment would cost. Historian Sarah McGill cross-referenced the coupon pointing of fabric to the coupon pointing of 3 dresses from 1943 to conclude that the woolen and cotton examples would have required roughly 3.5 yards of fabric and the rayon 2.5. couturier Digby Morton commented that he was making dresses from 3 yards of fabric, in contrast to the pre-war usage of 3.5 to 4. For my dress, I used 1.6 yards of the grey fabric and just under 1 yard of the purple, making total yardage of just over 2.5. It is worth noting that my fabric was wider than the standard wartime width of 36 inches, allowing me to fit more pieces across the width and reducing the length I needed. I suspect I would have been closer to 3 or 3.5 in a narrower fabric, putting me right at the edge of the common austerity era yardage. In the same way as the seam allowance requirements seem to value longevity over efficient use of fabric, some of the sewing requirements in the austerity regulations seem aimed at ensuring quality over speed. Achieving 13 minimum stitches per inch required some sampling, and in the end equated to about a 1.5 length setting on my domestic machine. While this is not a direct equivalent to any wartime machine setting, from experience this is quite a small stitch, as I would generally use about 2.5 for most of my modern sewing. It was also compulsory to reinforce the shoulder and armhole seams through either French, taped or overlocked seams. So I did this by both overlocking and top stitching, combining function with decoration in the same way the couture designers did for their austerity utility garments. Historian Geraldine Howell states that top stitching was limited, but not what that limit was, whereas British Pathé's Mode for Millions video describes 160 inches of pin tucking as being allowed, and Lydia Edwards refers to 160 inches of stitching total. My stitching along the front skirt, back waist, the front and back sleeve line totaled 153 inches, but this does not include the top stitching around the back edge of the collar or the front button stand. The collar and centre front stitching are constructional stitching, necessary for securing the fabric in place, so it is unclear if this would be included in the maximum allowance, or even what technique exactly the 160 inch limit refers to. McGill points to this kind of ambiguity in the austerity regulations, arguing that they were neither restrictive nor comprehensive enough to fully control clothing production. The requirement to have at least 4 inches between buttons was more of a challenge than the maximum number of 5 buttons, as I could only fit 4 along the front of my bodice. To compensate for the limited number, I took advantage of the freedom to choose the size of the buttons, selecting larger ones to more effectively fill the space. The final dress is easy to wear, with a loose-fitting waist, simple button front and tie belt. Its angled seams and colour contrasts keep it from being boring, and I think that it would not appear outdated among the austerity dresses such as those pictured in the Mode for Millions video. The austerity regulations forced no major changes to any process in the creation of the dress, though given the choice I would place the buttons closer together. The styles from the book that did break the rules could easily be adapted to bring them into line with the elimination of small details such as buttons and gathered necklines. Even without breaking any rules, the pattern for my dress remains fairly complex, with various angled pieces needing precise sewing and careful pressing to construct. This complexity would make it challenging to mass produce at pace. Again, this draws a parallel with the collection offered by London's elite designers, which was criticised by manufacturers as not being especially labour or material saving, and as being overall ill-suited to the trade's idea of popular dressmaking. Overall, the research involved in making my dress suggests that while austerity brought unprecedented government control to fashion, it neither invented new techniques nor totally eliminated the differences between the couture and the mass-produced segments of the British women's fashion industry.